This podcast is brought to you by Intel vPro.
Hi, guys. How are you doing?
Good morning. Happy Friday.
I don't know if you both saw this, but in Vermont, it was a Republican member of Vermont's House of Representatives who apologized earlier this week for pouring water onto a Democratic colleague's bag over 5 months, which is just like
insane.
Like, of all the things, because she probably was like, what's the worst thing I can do and get away with? It's like, make his bag wet.
Yeah, what's
right?
the line?
Like, that would be horrible for a woman. Yeah. Wet bag.
Well, welcome to the Campaign Moment on this Friday, June 21st. I'm Elahe Izadi, co-host of Post Reports, and this week, my co-host Aaron Blake is on a very well-deserved vacation, but I'm excited because this week I have two members of the Post's democracy team, national reporter Amy Gardner and Yvonne Wingett Sanchez, who covers voting issues in Arizona. Hey, Amy and Yvonne, I'm so excited you guys are here.
Hey, Elahe, so good to be here.
So Amy and Yvonne, this week we are going to be diving into some of the voting issues that you've both been covering in this election. But before we get into that, I was hoping you both could explain what the, quote, democracy team is at the Post and what you both do.
The democracy team was formed 2 years ago. In the aftermath of the 2020 election, there were more and more of us who were covering elections, not covering campaigns as political reporters, but covering elections as American institutions that were under threat because of efforts to subvert the result in 2020 and efforts to elect people who believed the election had been stolen in 2020. And it became such a big story that we formed a whole team.
And Yvonne, you're in Arizona thinking about this on the ground there, right?
Yeah, and you are right about the timeline, Amy, because my 2-year anniversary was yesterday.
So, oh, congratulations.
Yeah.
Best hire of the decade.
Oh, happy to be here. Everything Amy said, and really sort of telling the stories from the ground about how all of this is playing out. It's everything from profiles of the people on the front lines to the threats to changes in state laws and election manuals, like super boring Bibles of elections that really guide the way Americans vote and the motivations behind the people who are seeking to make changes or seeking to influence how people vote.
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting having you both here on a campaign show because so often we're talking about the campaign, but it's really interesting to think about the mechanics of the democratic process, which is really what the campaign is about. So actually, to start, I did want to start in Arizona because you both have been covering a criminal case unfolding in that state. And frankly, I feel like maybe a bunch of people missed this case or aren't paying as close attention to this case as they are the presidential campaign. And this is related to efforts to overturn the 2020 election. So just to start, Yvonne, why should people be paying attention to it? And at its core, what is this case about?
Sure. The case essentially is about an effort. It's known as the elector strategy. And this was a strategy that was implemented by Republicans, allies of Donald Trump in 2020, to try to replace the rightful Democratic electors who were in place for Joe Biden with a slate of Republican electors representing Trump. So essentially, at its core, this was an effort, according to prosecutors, to try to reverse or subvert the will of Arizona voters.
Yvonne, and who's charged in this case? How many people and what are they charged with?
The case has ensnared 18 Republicans from Arizona and beyond. Each of the 18 defendants is charged with 9 counts of illegal acts, and it includes everything from conspiracy to fraud and forgery. Some of them are high profile here in Arizona. It also includes people like Rudy Giuliani, people like Boris Epshteyn, a key advisor to Donald Trump's 2024 campaign and also worked with him in 2020. Mike Roman, who ran election day operations in 2020 and was a key advisor to Trump. And everyone has pled not guilty. And one of the biggest things that we're watching is that the calendar for court collides exactly with the election calendar, like almost matching dates up to election day for some of these defendants. It's unclear if that court calendar will hold, but it will certainly keep the case front and center, the issue of democracy front and center ahead of this election cycle and throughout this election cycle.
So just to do a little 101 here, Amy, what is an elector?
Yeah.
How does this process usually work? And then we can sort of see, like, what are these people accused of doing to disrupt that process?
Yes, let's take a step back and do a little Civics 101. The President of the United States is determined by the Electoral College, which is not actually a body or a place or a thing. It's groups of people who meet in the states. The number of electors that each state gets to have to cast ballots for the president is equal to the number of congressional seats plus 2 senators in each state. And what happens in a presidential election is that each campaign of the 2 major parties assigns or appoints electors to represent them if they win.
Like,
so
people to represent them, right?
Correct. So the only thing that has to happen before the election is that they are duly qualified. So they have to be qualified, and they have to be citizens. And so they wind up getting a seal of approval that they are eligible to serve as electors ahead of the election. And then when an election result is certified in each of the states, the governor certifies the result, sort of announces officially with a document, it's called a certificate of ascertainment, that it will be Joe Biden's electors who will vote in the Electoral College, or it will be Donald Trump's electors who will vote, depending on who wins that state. So in 2020, Donald Trump's campaign and the RNC and state parties got together and decided that they were going to arrange for Trump's electors to meet on the day that the electors were scheduled to meet, which was December 14th, in 7 states that had been certified for Joe Biden. And Arizona was one of those, and Georgia and Nevada and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and New Mexico. And am I forgetting anywhere? There are 7.
Michigan.
It takes a team.
It does. It takes a village. And Arizona is now the 4th state where criminal charges have been filed against the Trump electors who met and signed certificates stating that Trump was the winner of that state and sending those certificates on to the National Archives and Congress and U.S. courts. So it's a big deal. It was it was a huge effort. And the question is whether the electors met as a contingency in the event that lawsuits that were still pending to contest the results that year, or whether they were intentionally meeting in order to subvert a popular result. And the prosecutors in all these cases are claiming that it was the latter.
Just jumping off of that, in Arizona, what have these defendants said about these charges? What have they said that they were up to or what they were doing?
A lot of the electors have not spoken, although their attorneys have maintained that they've done nothing wrong. There are variations of, we showed up, we did exactly what we were told to do. We trusted the people who asked us to do this. They were attorneys. They were really important Republicans who told us this had to be done in order for us to maintain any sort of chance for Trump to remain president.
And Trump hasn't been charged in this, right? There's other things that Donald Trump is facing, but this is not like a legal charge he's facing.
Right. He's named in the indictment, or not named, but described as an unofficial co-conspirator.
Well, it's interesting hearing you describe this, because one of my main questions is what could have happened had this had been successful. And, prosecutors are alleging this is a plot that was underway and they're charging people over it. In their view, if it had been successful, what would have been the outcome?
Well, I mean, there was a group of advisors close to Trump in his 2020 campaign and allies in Congress who were very actively seeking to present these dueling slates of electors during the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021, a day that most of us will never forget, when the attacks on the Capitol happened. And the goal was to have members of Congress and the U.S. Senate to protest the Biden electors in those states, and having the body go along with that. I mean, we all remember the headlines about how then President Trump pressured his vice president, Mike Pence, to intervene as the presiding officer over the joint session to choose to count the Trump electors in those states, which would have meant that Donald Trump got across the threshold of 270 electoral votes is what it takes to win. The goal was for Trump to be reelected.
And so now that brings me to 2024, because as this case is, unfolding right now, we are in an election year. Donald Trump is the presumptive Republican nominee. And it raises this other question for me of, okay, what about the state of electors? What's going on with these people? And also what's going on with the 2024 electors?
There are electors from 2020 who are serving as electors again in 2024 for Trump, in Michigan, for example. So if Trump wins Michigan, the electors who meet to cast their votes for Trump in Lansing will include people who served as electors in 2020. And that's interesting, to say the least. But some things have changed since 2020. Congress passed a new law that amends and changes the Electoral Count Act, which is the federal law that governs the counting of electoral votes and the joint session that takes place on January 6th every 4 years. It's harder to contest a state's electoral slate. It requires 20% of the body, if I'm not mistaken, of both chambers to even sort of nominate a state for a vote to contest their electoral votes. And we also have Kamala Harris as vice president presiding over the joint session in all likelihood. So there's certainly no chance.
Oh, as opposed to, like the situation before, the incumbent was President
Right.
Trump, Mike Pence was presiding. So unless Joe Biden is planning to do something like this, you don't have a situation where you have a Trump ally trying to do this.
You also have all these criminal charges. I think it's not trivial to imagine that people will be much more reluctant to take action based on the advice of the Trump campaign or the RNC or their state GOP, given what we now know is hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of dollars of legal fees that all these people are facing right now.
Oh, the repercussion of that. Yeah, Yvonne?
Well, Amy's gonna totally kill me, but another potential guardrail of this is those legal fees for a lot of these people. I mean, some of the legal fees have been paid for, at least here in Arizona, by an insurance company. But that's, going to end.
Wait, why is Amy going to kill you over this? What's peek behind the veil? What's going on? Are you guys working on a story right now or something?
No, we actually wrote about this scintillating topic a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, insurance?
Insurance policies that pay for legal bills in Arizona. She's just making fun of me because it's a little weedy.
Oh.
It's super weedy, but it's really important. At some point here in the very near future, that coverage is going to end in all likelihood. And so a deterrent for this sort of behavior, as one theory goes, is, making these people be on the hook for that sort of behavior. And hopefully that serves as a deterrent for future potential efforts to undermine the electoral results. And so that's another important, super real life, relatable guardrail.
Mm-hmm. And Amy mentioned that some of the electors that were involved in the 2020 effort are poised now to serve again. Why does that matter?
It matters because you don't know necessarily what they are going to do. Will they stay inside of the guardrails? Will they try to cause chaos in some other way? Will they weaponize real information in a way that sort of deepens suspicions and skepticisms about American government? And what we have seen since the 2020 election is a further deepening of mistrust in institutions, mistrust of processes, misunderstandings of how all of this works. And on some level, a complete deliberate effort to sow that sort of chaos.
Donald Trump has said the only way he can lose this year is if Joe Biden cheats. And there is a significant percentage of the Republican electorate that believes what Donald Trump says, that believes to this day that the 2020 election was stolen. In fact, there are more people today who believe elections are full of fraud in our country than did in 2020. And that's just a cocktail for unrest, for even violence. And that's something that election officials are preparing for around the country.
There's so much more to talk about, and that's actually a great moment to hit pause, and we're going to come back and talk about political deepfakes and concerns about violence at the polls in November. We'll be right back.
Hey, I'm Leanne Caldwell. I spend my days talking to senators, House members, White House officials, and campaign insiders, the people who actually make the decisions in Washington. Well, guess what? You can learn all the things I know in a newsletter from the Washington Post called The Early Brief. You can get it at wapo.st/earlybrief. It'll come in your inbox weekdays at 6 a.m.
You know, I'm wondering, since both of you are looking at what's happening in the campaign through a lens of what does this mean for democracy and how is the democratic system prepared to meet this moment? And the conversations we've had on this show about artificial intelligence and how quickly this technology is advancing is making me wonder, you know, like, Amy, from your perspective and your reporting, what have you seen about the threat of this technology of AI, especially when it comes to deep fakes, these videos that are doctored to present reality that's totally altered, what those videos, the threats they pose to voters and also to democracy?
A couple of thoughts. I mean, it's a brand new area and we don't know what it's going to look like because it's just so new. There's one really noteworthy example that we all read about in New Hampshire during primary season, where a Democratic operative who was working for a long shot candidate who was seeking the Democratic nomination against Biden, sent around a robocall that was supposed to be Joe Biden. And it was this computer-generated voice talking about how the primary was a bunch of malarkey.
Actually, let's take a quick listen to that fake robocall.
It's important that you save your vote for the November election. Voting this Tuesday only enables the Republicans in their quest to elect Donald Trump again.
I mean, that sounds like Biden.
It does, although if you go to a training about AI, they would point out some of the things to listen for. It sounds a little bit truncated and edited, and if you train your ear, and most voters aren't going to train their ears this way, but if you train your ear, you can say, this doesn't sound real to me. But the problem is so many people aren't listening that closely. They get a robocall from Biden, oh, I shouldn't vote. So the biggest threat, I think, of these recordings is actually from international actors, because one of the takeaways of that New Hampshire instance is that the gentleman who's responsible for that call and has admitted it has been charged. He faces serious felony charges and fines. So that's a consequence that could serve as a deterrent for Americans. But does it serve as a deterrent for someone in Iran or Russia or China? And that's a really important question. I've also had it explained to me by election officials in the states that here's a scenario that they expect to see in the fall.
Oh, great. Let's get into some worst case scenarios. Amy, go first, then Yvonne.
Okay. I've told my husband that I'm driving to go vote this morning on my way into the office. As I'm parking my car, a voicemail registers on my phone, and I listen to it, and it's my husband's voice saying, hey, sweetie, I just want to let you know that I went to vote and they said that they're closed for today, but they're going to have it up and running tomorrow. So go cast your ballot tomorrow. And it's going to sound like my husband. And
Wait,
I'm
what?
going to...
Like, who has the time and energy to target people, like figure out whose husband is who?
It's so easy.
Really?
In my case, it would never happen because my husband literally never picks up phone calls from numbers that he doesn't recognize.
Or it's like a tell, like, you're leaving me a voicemail? Like, who leaves voicemail?
Right. But so they'll call somebody and they'll record their voice, and that's how they generate the AI recording, the fake recording, by getting a snippet of your voice and running it through a computer program. But yeah, that is what election officials are worried about when it comes to AI. And of course, as a public service announcement, let me just say, there will not be elections held the day after the election.
It's just the one day. You can maybe do early voting in some places, but yeah.
And some places you can get your ballot in after the election, but only if it's postmarked by the election day.
Yeah. We'll have you guys back on to explain it all so we all are on the same page.
Right.
Yvonne, are you hearing anything like this in Arizona? What are they concerned about?
Yeah. So I went to a training a couple of weeks ago. It was a deep fake training for the media, the Secretary of State's office, along with partners like the Brennan Center. hosted this event.
Okay, the exercise you are about to participate in is specifically designed to be impossible to beat.
It was hours of putting us through the paces of, we were faced with scenarios that included AIs, and real life AIs, deepfakes, were made right before our eyes of various people. Adrian Fontes, who's the Secretary of State, Democrat, held this training. It was the first of its kind in the nation. And right before our very eyes, there he is.
Hello. This is a public service advisory featuring an AI version of Arizona Secretary of State Adrian Fontes.
It looks super real, and if you didn't know any better, there he is. It looks like it's his office, speaking another language.
Let's try talking in German. Damit ein böswilliger Angreifer Inhalte für ihn generieren kann, müssen weder Sie noch Ihr
But some of the scenarios included reporters doing actual news reports, what looked like news reports, telling people this polling location is closed, or this location isn't open, or there's a flood at this location, so go to that location. Totally chaotic. And these messages rip across WhatsApp. So in chats that are private, not publicly viewable, so you can't even get in front of it to debunk it or pre-bunk it. And next thing you know, it's just chaos and people don't show up to vote. And those are the sorts of scenarios that they're preparing for.
So what are officials doing right now to prepare? What are just some things, Yvonne, that our listeners can pay attention to help understand, wait a minute, is this real or not? Just to do that double check for ourselves.
So folks here in Arizona are going to start seeing some public messaging on some of this. They are going to be told to watch the way that a mouth moves on a video. Make sure that it lines up with the words that are being spoken. The biggest thing that they are going to be telling voters and the public is just double check, go to the source. If you see something and it sounds off, if it even seems real, and you just gut check it, fact check it, call the Secretary of State's office, call your local election official. They're going to be putting out phone numbers, telling people through these public awareness campaigns to just go to the primary source, reach out, call. We are here to serve you. And they are staffing up in a way that they think will be able to handle the level of calls that they expect. Now, they might be over preparing altogether.
Yeah, that's another question I have. Is this hyped up, or is this a real thing?
Who knows? That's the thing. I mean, they are preparing for worst case scenarios, and the cost to prepare for worst case scenarios on all sorts of different fronts outweighs the expense of not.
There's also this assumption that's rooted in some reasonable sort of premises, but there's this assumption that AI, particularly by foreign actors, will target Democrats in order to help Donald Trump win, because there's an assumption that those top three sort of U.S. foes that I mentioned earlier, Iran, Russia, and China, would rather see Trump president because he's more destabilizing to our country. That's the theory. That's not my opinion. And I think it's worth, this is a little weedy too, but it's worth thinking about whether that will even work, because Democrats vote in other ways than on election day than Republicans do.
They have higher participation in early voting
and mail voting.
And mail voting.
And Georgia has something like 3 weeks of early voting, and it has a robust absentee ballot program that anyone can participate in. So disrupting election day voting is more likely to disrupt Republican voting than Democratic voting. That's just an interesting little political dynamic.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. One last thing I did want to hit on before we sign off here is a topic that you touched on, which is violence, potential violence at the polls. I mean, we could talk at length about this, but just really quickly, in 2020, there was all this concern about violence showing up at polling stations and, people showing up with guns or intimidating voters. And I'm just wondering if those concerns are coming up again this year. And if so, what is being done to prepare poll workers for any potential violence at polling stations this year?
So I had a conversation on Tuesday this week with a chief of staff for an election official. And I asked him, what's the worst realistic thing that is keeping you up at night? And his response without hesitation was an angry person driving his car into a polling location. And that's the sort of scenarios that they're preparing for. People armed with guns, shooters, they're doing active shooting drills. Most of the counties throughout Arizona, we have 15 of them, have received active shooting like emergency drill kits so that they've been taught to like apply tourniquets in case there's physical violence. Obviously, they hope that those sorts of things don't need to be used, but they have seen the headlines, they have seen the anger. And so I think we're going to see law enforcement out in a way that we haven't seen before. They're not taking any chances.
I mean, hearing you describe this on the one hand, it's deeply depressing that officials need to prepare for all these worst case scenarios.
Totally.
And are going through all these measures. And so I just want to acknowledge that. On the other hand, I don't know, it gives me some measure of comfort to know that at least there's a plan or some preparation going into trying to mitigate or prepare for these threats, because I think in 2020, there were a lot of concerns. And then we all saw what happened on January 6th. And in the retrospective, was enough done to prevent that or to respond to the moment? But I guess I would just ask, are we more prepared in 2024 than we were in 2020?
There's no question that election officials and the country generally are more prepared this time than any of us were in 2020. And it's worth noting that the effort to overturn the result in 2020 failed. So if it's even harder to do this year, then that means it's even less likely to succeed because people are more prepared. And they didn't succeed last time either. You know what I mean? So I think that's a really important comfort that there are guardrails in place. They held 4 years ago. The likelihood is that they will hold again. I think we're all a little bit on edge because there is still this possibility of so much mistrust, and civil unrest is a potential outgrowth of that. And I think that's the thing that I'm most worried about, is whether this turns physical.
I agree with Amy. And I will say, I came back from a reporting trip yesterday and saw on the ground for my own two eyes, everything that this one county was doing to try to pull off an election. No one is convinced that there aren't going to be some little mistakes. There always have been. They're going to do their best to run a good election. They're working really hard. And that gives me a measure of hope.
Mm-hmm. Well, one question we always like to ask our guests before they sign off is, what is the next big campaign story or the moment that they're paying attention to next week? So, Amy, I'll start with you. What is the big story that's on your radar in the coming week?
Isn't the first debate next week?
Yes.
I don't know anyone who's not going to watch that. And I've already mentioned my husband. I'll mention him again. He's even going to watch. And he doesn't usually tune into the elections until September.
We should bring him on the show. Do a roundtable with a voter.
Yeah.
Yvonne,
focus group of one.
Yeah, focus group of one. I mean, Yvonne, obviously the debate is a big one. Is there anything else you're going to be paying attention to?
I'm paying attention to RNC delegates from Arizona. Stay
Republican
tuned.
National Convention, yes.
Yep.
So you're going to see which delegates are going to be chosen for that.
Yep. Which delegates are actually going to go.
Oh, interesting. Well, we'll have to have you come back on and explain all of the drama. I can smell drama a mile away. So
I think you guys need to have a whole show about the Arizona Republican Party's insurance policy that pays for the lawsuits.
It's a special limited series. Well, that is it for today's episode. Thank you, Amy and Yvonne, so much.
My pleasure.
Thanks for having me.
Amy Gardner is a national reporter, and Yvonne Wingett Sanchez reports on voting issues in Arizona for The Post. My regular co-host, Aaron Blake, will be back from vacation next week, but in the meantime, you can find a link to his newsletter, The Campaign Moment, in our show notes at postreports.com. That's it for this week on The Campaign Moment. If you're tuning in via Post Reports, we'll keep bringing you these conversations most Fridays, but you'll be able to hear more from Aaron Blake and our other colleagues by also following the Campaign Moment show feed itself. That's where we'll be dropping extra episodes as campaign news picks up. So be sure to look for that wherever you are listening. Today's episode was produced by Ted Muldoon and Laura Benshoff. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Griff Witte. Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Monica Campbell, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Rennie Stronovsky, Sabby Robinson, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Trinity Webster Bass, Allison Michaels, Renita Jablonski, and Martine Powers. I'm Elahe Izadi. Have a great weekend.
Hey, I'm Leanne Caldwell. I spend my days talking to senators, House members, White House officials, and campaign insiders, the people who actually make the decisions in Washington. Well, guess what? You can learn all the things I know in a newsletter from the Washington Post called The Early Brief. You can get it at wapo.st/earlybrief. It'll come in your inbox weekdays at 6 a.m.